Hello again, everybody. Welcome to Keene State College's career development class, where our students here are both are juniors or seniors usually, and we spend the semester taking a look at skills, uh, tools that they're going to be using to get out and when they graduate, having their own LinkedIn accounts, having demo reels, their own web pages. One of the most, I think, interesting aspects of this, certainly for me, is to speak to both Keene State graduates, film department graduates, once we became a department, and other professionals within the industry, sharing their experience with our students. That's always the question, and I'm no different. Students ask us, how do you get your first job? Who do I talk to? What's the best thing to put on my resume? So we talk about things like that. In the past, and you can find these on the Keene State College website. William Shatner 2 weeks ago spoke to the class. Obviously, the star and of Star Trek and Boston Legal and author, singer, writer. Lee Unkrich was last week. A friend of mine who is an Academy Award-winning director of the Toy Story trilogies, Finding Nemo, Monsters Inc., Coco. And this week, we're pleased to welcome our first Keene State College graduate. Actually, this guy was in my very first, this tells you how old he is, but he looks a lot younger than I do. My very first class, I got here in, well, I won't say when I got here, but I've been here for quite a while, and he was in my very first class. We've got some stories we can tell about it, but I'd like to welcome a very successful editor who houses himself now in New York City. We'll get a chance to talk about the differences between the different coasts. But welcome to our screen, James Steelman. James, thanks for making it.
Hey, Tom, thanks for having me.
It's good to have you. Tell us about, obviously, what I think our students are interested in is your history, either recollections, what you thought when you got here at Keene State. I'll let our folks know, and James, you certainly know, everything's digital. Everything's nonlinear, particularly for editing, and that's James' strength. He's got a lot of other skills. But when we first got here, we cut on 16 millimeter film, and there's a thing called a flatbed, which has upwards of, we have picture and then 2 reels of sound that you can cut, and they're literally going through spinners. It was piled with junk, covered with dust, and I said, James, you're our editor for our advanced project, here you go. So, James, tell us some stories.
Well, how far back should I go?
As far back as you want. Maybe not like the crib. When I was a baby, Mom said this. And
Well, I am a New Hampshire native. I was born and raised outside of Concord. My dad owned a movie theater when I was growing up, and he also collected 16 millimeter films. So I've been around film my whole life, as long as I can remember. And after high school, I took a few years off to kind of get my feet wet out in the world. And then when I decided to go to college, I wanted to go to a state school because I wanted to keep the cost low. And Keene State was, lo and behold, the only one that had a film program. And that's what I was really genuinely interested in. And so that's how I ended up at Keene. And when I first got there, I don't mind telling you the year, I started there in 1991. And it was a very small program. It existed entirely in the basement of Parker Hall. And it consisted of maybe, I'm guessing, maybe 30 or 40 students at the most.
I'd be surprised at the time, and just to interject, we weren't even the film department yet, if you remember. It was theater, arts,
speech, and film. Yeah.
Film, I think we had like maybe 8 or 10 people following it, and you were among them.
Was it that few? It seems like there were.
It was pretty small, but you're right. It certainly wasn't what it is today.
But anyway, so I learned everything that I learned in film school. I learned with 8 and 16 millimeter film, and I loved it. In fact, I think the joy of editing became apparent to me splicing film, kind of seeing what I thought it was going to look like as I was making the splice, and then actually projecting it and feeling the effect that a simple edit can have on your work. And I just fell in love with that process right away. So
not to denigrate, I mean, we were such a small program, as you say, at the time. There were really, to my knowledge, only 3 people in the film faculty, quote unquote, whereas we have many, many more now. Do you feel you were like almost self-taught?
I feel like I understood a lot about how editing worked before I ever edited anything. My dad was not just a movie theater owner. He was a movie buff, a real historian. And he would literally sit his kids down and say, okay, we're going to watch this. And we had a screening room in our living room way back before VCRs. And, you know, a big, like 15-foot screen that would come down from the ceiling. And we'd watch 16 millimeter projected films in our living room. And he would talk to us about them as though we were in a class. And you know, if something particularly scary or funny or exciting was happening, more often than not, you know, it could be attributed in a lot of ways to the editing. And so I remember having discussions with him, even as a little kid, about how, you know, well, this edit right here is what made you jump, and this edit right here is what makes you laugh. And so I would say I was self-taught in a lot of ways from the theory side of it, but definitely I had never, even though I learned how to splice film when I was like 8 years old, I had never edited anything per se until I got to film school. And so, yeah, I wouldn't say I was self-taught entirely in that regard. But lucky enough, Tom, that was way back when Paul Barnes was still teaching classes every once in a while. So I was very fortunate to have a class with Paul Barnes. And even though that was more about that class was more about how to organize and manage an editing room with film, that was really fun, really useful information. That's what helped me get my first assistant editor job, actually. Was that
For folks today, Paul Barnes being one of Ken's earliest editors, right?
Yeah, and
Burns.
He did a lot of his work, yeah, early on. Yeah, did the Civil War. He'd actually done a couple of features too that I was familiar with at the time, feature documentaries for other filmmakers.
Bonnie and Clyde.
He did the thin blue line.
Thin Blue Line
With Errol Morris, and he had also done a really obscure documentary called "Say Amen Somebody," and it was a film that I had seen at my dad's theater, and loved it. It was great, high energy, wonderful documentary that probably very few people these days know anything about. But that was a Paul Barnes film as well.
Right. So tell us about your progress after you graduated. You know, what's the path? Everybody wants to know the path.
Yeah, well, I got my first paying job right out of Keene State. There was an independent filmmaker from Vermont named Nora Jacobson, and she came to speak with film students the spring before I graduated, and she was looking for help on her independent feature, which was very low budget, but she did have some money and she could afford to pay some positions. And thanks to my experience editing the senior project, as well as having Paul Barnes' class under my belt, she chose me to be the assistant editor on her film. And so that was literally right after graduation. Spent like 6 weeks up in Norwich, Vermont, syncing dailies and organizing and cataloging all of her film. And then once her shoot was over, she kind of took over and she edited it herself. So I didn't get to really stay on after that. But that's how I got my first job. Just somebody came to the college and hired me. But after that, it started to get difficult. I had a pretty rough 4 years out of college, primarily because at that time, the industry was really transitioning to digital. And I can't blame Keene State for not teaching me the digital stuff, because at that time, even though Hollywood and the television industry were segueing into digital, it was such an expensive option for editing. I don't think very many film schools in the country offered courses in it. But everywhere I went looking for work, I was asked, "Do you know Avid? Do you know Avid?" And I didn't know what Avid was for a long time. So finally, in the year 2000, I was fortunate enough to score a job at Avid Technology. And part of the deal then was that because they were a very lucrative company at that time, they were really the only professional editing suite anybody took seriously. They hired me to be a tech support rep, and I enjoyed 6 months paid training on everything operational and technical about their editing system. And so I got paid to learn how to use Avid. And in return, I answered phones for them for 2 years. And but my editing career still didn't start yet.
Right.
I'm sure you recall what happened after that.
Yeah.
I came back to Keene State College, and I remember fairly vividly that I was speaking with you and Larry Benequist and saying, "Man, I've been working at this company called Avid, and it's amazing. And you guys should see this, and you should really teach your students this stuff because this is the wave of the future." And I don't remember if it was you or Larry, but one of you said, "Well, why not come back to Keene State and help us get it set up, and you can teach our kids how to use it." And I was happy to do that. I wound up doing that for, I think, 6 years.
Well, we'd had before that, and we knew you were at Avid, but Matt Newton, who is now, he's one of our grads, everybody, and he's the director of the New Hampshire Film Commission. He worked on our first Avid, which was a couple years after you graduated, James, so you just missed the cusp. But yeah, and it was a clunky device, and trying to force it to try to get to work. And bringing you in to run our labs and having the experience and skill that you did, we still have the Avid versus Premiere battle, and I'm losing that one. But I still will scream to my dying days that I prefer Avid. But I think it's probably because it's like the Mac versus PC issue. Is what did you start on?
Yeah, I think that by now Premiere and Avid are similar in a lot of ways. But speaking for myself, I can tell you that with over 50 edit jobs, I've never used anything but Avid, and I've never been offered a job that was anything but Avid.
Right.
And I've never had to turn down a job because it was Premiere and I didn't feel comfortable editing with Premiere or any other app. So the general consensus in the industry right now is that Premiere is perfectly suitable for smaller scale projects, for shorter projects. It's used a lot in advertising. It's used a lot in web work. And where it's not used a lot is in larger projects that require multiple editors that are sharing media over a shared file storage system.
Right.
That, for collaboration and for long form work, Avid is still preferred by most production companies, and I think by most editors, honestly. So you can take that for what it's worth. I've been editing professionally now for 13 years, and I've never worked on anything other than Avid. So anyway, but there's nothing wrong with Premiere. Premiere's fine.
Right. I've always said that I see Premiere as being more a prosumer level editor that might be a little bit easier to learn, but all of my contacts out on the West Coast, it's all Avid, blah, blah, blah. Enough about the Avid. We'll start pushing that. Talk to us about your progress from all of your projects into, holy cow, editing the Jeffrey Epstein thing on Netflix, and congratulations on that.
Thank you very much. That was a great time. And I should point out, I wasn't the only editor on it. That was a large team of editors. That was a really challenging project. So after I left Keene State in 2007, and I moved to Los Angeles because I was getting old, and I figured if I wanted to have a career as an editor, I'd better get started because I was nearly 40 before I worked professionally as an editor. I was very, very fortunate to have friends in Los Angeles that were already ensconced in the system, and they were already established editors. And one of them knew me well from my Avid days, knew that I was capable of editing professionally, and convinced a really small company to give me a shot. They were pestering him at the time to do the job, and it was a weekly entertainment news program that was being made for the Swedish television market, although it was being made in English. And it was, looking back on it, it was a very simple formula, but I was the only editor on it, and it was a weekly show. So I had 1 week to finish a half-hour show every week, and the pay wasn't great. It was definitely, at the time, it was more money than I ever made in my life, and I was thrilled by it. Of course, in hindsight, I recognize that they paid me a very low rate for an editor.
Yep.
But I wound up doing 3 seasons of that show for them over a year and a half, and I edited 60 episodes of it for them. And that was thankfully enough to kind of get somewhat of my bona fides to move on to something that was going to be broadcast in this country. Although I can say the first 3 or 4 years, the gigs were not back to back. There was definitely some hustling happening in between jobs to try to keep working. And that aspect of it has never really changed too much. Although now I'm lucky. I know enough people in town here now so that I frequently will just get calls. If a job ends, I just take some time off until I get an offer, or if it's taken too long, I start ringing people's bells.
You say contacts are pretty important.
They are the most important thing. And I know a lot of mediocre editors, and I know sloppy editors that still work all the time because of their network skills, and because they're really nice people, and because they get along with everybody, and they never get angry or lose their patience. And so they're the kind of people that others want to work with. And so if they need a couple of weeks more to get something polished up, people will deal with that, because they don't have to deal with an unpleasant personality. They're dealing with somebody that they enjoy working with, who will take direction and take notes and deliver something that they want. I think that that's something that I had to learn early on, because I had a little bit of a temper, and of course I was a film school grad, and I was going to be a director, and I'm the editor. How dare you question my edit decisions? And I had to learn pretty quickly that, yeah, as an editor, you do get a lot of say in the edits, but it is a collaborative process, and you're more likely to continue working steadily if you are super easygoing, especially as an editor, because editors get a lot of stuff thrown at them. And it's very easy. It makes your head spin sometimes. And it's very easy to kind of lose your sense of propriety and bark at somebody. And I can tell you from experience that that's a big mistake. One of the key things that they never teach in film school, be somebody that people want to work with. Be that person.
Great.
Yeah.
So how'd you get the Netflix gig? And then I know we've got some questions from the students.
Well, the Netflix gig was that was my first Netflix gig, which was a pretty big deal, really. As a freelancer, I was excited to get it. A lot of Netflix shows are done by top, what I'd consider top tier editors, and I never had an opportunity to work on one. But about maybe 6 or 7 months before I got that job, I was hired by a company called Radical Media to work for 1 week on a National Geographic show. The showrunner knew me from years earlier. He was in a bind. He needed somebody that he knew could work quickly, because it was a massive show. And he needed somebody that could come in and bring a fine cut to picture lock. And he had a week to do it. And I nearly quit that job after 2 days, because it was that insane. And I didn't do it in a jerky way. I leveled with this guy and said, look, I think you got the wrong guy. I just can't, the workload that you're expecting to get done in this amount of time, it's just not, I can't do it. It's not doable. And thankfully, he was a very reasonable person. We worked it out. The schedule got adjusted, and I wound up on that show for 7 weeks. I helped lock every episode of that show. And then he had such nice things to say about me. I wound up getting on another job called The Wrong Man, same company, segued right into that. And then The Wrong Man was being produced by Joe Berlinger, who's a fairly noteworthy filmmaker. And I was very pleased to be working with him, although I didn't work with him directly too much. But while I was working on Wrong Man, this top secret project was happening at Radical. And it was always just referred to as the Florida Project. And nobody knew anything about it. It was top secret. When I was wrapping up on Wrong Man, somebody from the Florida Project approached me and said, we hear you're really good. We hear you work quick. We need somebody to come on to the Florida Project. Are you interested? And I was like, well, you know, I need to know more about it. And they said, it's a Netflix show about Jeffrey Epstein. And I jumped at the chance. And in fact, I think that's the most excited I've ever been about a job. It was just, it's because I knew right away it was going to be a huge deal.
Right.
And that's how it happened. So yeah, again, it was a networking thing. I stocked a lot of goodies in my edit bag. So I had cookies and chips and all kinds of snacks and candy. And people would just love to come and visit and hang out with me because I always had goodies. Again, be the kind of person that people like to work with.
Right.
It helps.
Before I turn it over to the students, I had one other question. Is the rumor true that you turned down the opportunity to edit the first season of Survivor? I've heard that.
No, that's not true.
That's not true. Oh, okay.
Nope, that's a weird rumor. Did you see that on like the Hollywood Reporter or something?
No, for some reason I thought you'd said it. So maybe I just made it up. I dreamed it.
Yeah, I don't remember ever being offered a job on ABC. That's an ABC show, I think, right? Is that Survivor? Is that ABC?
I don't watch it. No.
I don't think I worked for NBC, but I've never worked for ABC.
Yeah. So anyway, folks, opening up to questions for James about editing, about working in the industry, about Keene State, whatever the case may be. Who has questions? Only one of you sent me any of your questions, so I'm going to ask Amy if you want to ask your questions.
Hi. Is there any organizational method that you use in your editing process? Because I know starting it might be a little, like, how do you start the process, I guess?
It's all about organization, and only a well-organized project will be edited on schedule. I don't do that. That's the task of assistant editors. I do a certain amount of organization of my own, but the project will be organized by other people on, you know. To try to answer your question, if I did have to organize my own stuff, yeah, you absolutely have, you know, even if it's just a short project, organization is absolutely critical because you need to be able to find stuff quickly. Especially if you're if you're working on your own thing, I suppose it would be less important because you would be the only person involved. And so you would kind of know where everything was. But the rule of thumb that I was taught way back in the day was you should always organize your project in a way that if something happened to you, somebody else could come in and sit in your seat and they wouldn't have any problem picking up where you left off because everything would be logical and would make sense, and they would find things in places that they'd expect to find them. So, you know, for example, I'm sitting in front of a project right now, and I would say this isn't one of the better organized shows I've been on, but the folder structure is, the first folder is for assemblies, for cuts, for current cuts, and for archived cuts. The second folder is for all the clips that we're using. This particular show is what's called a clip show. So It's an hour-long format for discovery. It's made up of viral videos, viral web videos, as well as a lot of stock footage. This is a quarantine special. We didn't have any crews to film anything with this. So there's a lot of stock footage. There are interviews with talent. So every segment or sequence, every it's like made up of like 7 stories. So every story has its own bin, and inside every bin are all of the major elements that we use for that story. And then we have a separate folder for audio, and that's broken down into separate folders for music, separate folders for sound effects, separate folders for voiceover narration. There's another system, large folder for graphics. And then there's an editor folder, and every editor on the show has their own folder. And that's where my organization happens. So within my edit folder, I'll always have bins for my most current cut. I'll have bins that I call work bins. So while I'm working, that's where the sequence that I'm working on lives. That's a organizational side note. You should always work from duplicates of your sequence. Every day you start a new day's work, duplicate your sequence and work from that day's duplicate, and you always have a backup copy of your sequence where you ended the previous day. Let's see, also in my edit folder, I've got my music selections, my sound effects selections, because I'm drawing from a large library of sound effects, so I don't want to have to browse through 5,000 whooshes and booms every time I want one. I'll go early on in the process and find the ones I like, pick maybe a dozen of them and throw them into a bin, and just go in there when I need one. Yeah, so, I mean, I don't want to go on and on forever about it. I can't state it enough, emphatically enough. Organization is critical in large projects. There's 6 other editors on the show. So if they need something that I've been working on, they should be able to go into my edit folder and find it really easily, So, yeah. And by the same token, if I need, I work from a script. So if I get a note, the network wants this byte added, I need to know exactly where to find that person's interview or their script, and get to work with it right away. Get it in my timeline as quickly as possible. So as soon as you start working for money, it's all about efficiency, and your speed as an editor is definitely something that people are going to notice. And the faster you are, the more popular you're going to be, especially if you're not sloppy. But if you're quick and efficient, that's a good way to secure good network connections.
That editing system that you glimpsed for us might have been before we started our broadcast. Is that your personal one? Is that owned? And obviously these folks, when they're just graduating, it's nice to have your own system, but they're not going to have the 3-screen, super beefy, Avid, hardware-driven editing system.
Yeah, I mean, you don't really need that. And honestly, the way the industry's changed so much in the last 6 months, the system that's in front of me right now is not my system. It is from Postworks. Okay. It was provided to me by the production company. And with remote work, I think you'll find that is more often going to be the case, more often than not going to be the case. And the reason is because of compatibility. Newer versions of Avid don't necessarily play nice with older versions of Avid. And same goes with Premiere or any other edit suite. And so on a collaborative project, the show's organizers are going to want everybody to be on the same version of Avid, running essentially the same hardware. And so to homogenize that, they send systems out. Now, another thing about the remote workflow that's changed is that the system that I work on is not an Avid system per se. The system that I have sitting here at my desk does not have Avid installed on it. It has a very fast network connection, and I use it to remote control an Avid system that is sitting in Manhattan at Postworks. So, and it's remarkable. This is a relatively new development over the last 6 months. This technology has really been fine-tuned. It's so good that I completely forget that I am not sitting at an Avid system. I'm sitting at a computer that's running Avid on another system, and it's just like sitting in an Avid system.
And I've been trying to talk to IT about setting something like that up because with the pandemic, these folks can't come into the labs.
Right.
You get remote control. I've been
Yeah.
looking into that.
Yeah, it's the system that we use is called RGS. It's an HP product, and I highly recommend it. It is flawless, and I think it's a relatively low maintenance procedure for IT administrators. It doesn't seem to be that. It doesn't seem to be that. I mean, there's some setup involved, and the setup is a little complicated. But once it's running, I mean, knock on wood, it's been very problem-free.
Right.
So, yeah.
Other questions, folks?
I have a question. Oh, sorry, Curtis.
That's okay. Anna, jump in.
I mean, I know this answer is different for everyone, but for you, would you say that New York is better for filmmakers or LA?
I think it's a toss-up. I liked LA a lot. I didn't care for the car culture aspect of it. I'm a kid from the woods. I grew up in New Hampshire, and I'm just not into spending 4 hours a day in a car. So there was a lot about LA and Hollywood that I absolutely loved. I would never discourage anybody from going out there, but I would encourage people to know what they're getting into, especially with the car culture thing. The public transportation system isn't great. New York City, as everyone knows, I think, has excellent public transportation. I live in Brooklyn and I work in Manhattan. I've got like a 40-minute train ride into the city. It's easy peasy, and I don't have to own a car, which is wonderful. As far as the amount of work goes, I think that if you want to try to break in to big budget feature films, you need to go to Los Angeles. If you're only really interested in visual storytelling and it's not important to you whether that's in a cinematic context or a television context, then I think it might be easier to score work in New York, because I think there's more work happening in New York, honestly. But if you want to do features, yeah, you pretty much have to go to Hollywood. That's the way. I mean, that's my opinion anyway.
James and I were talking about that beforehand, and it's always been my experience, of course that was 20 years ago, that feature films that are shot in New York bring their production crews from LA to New York for X number of days or weeks. Might hire some day people, but then they're gone. And it had been my experience, exactly as James says, is New York is more television. And I fell in love with television. I loved it.
Yeah, obviously I set out to work in film, and my early love was definitely for cinema.
Yeah.
And I still love it. But I've and if you had told me when I was a film student that I was going to wind up being a television editor, I might have been a little upset about that. But the reality is, it's largely still the same thing. And I think a lot of my experience doing this work is similar to what film editors experience. There are some differences, sure, especially on larger budget things, which I'm sure you'll hear a lot about that from Alan Bell in a couple of weeks. But I still get to tell stories. I still get to be a storyteller. And even on historical docs or a show like the Epstein show, whether it's fictional or non-fictional, whether it has special effects or none, whether it's all straight cuts, it's still storytelling. And you still, as an editor, get to enjoy a very fun creative process of creating a composition of picture, music, and dialogue and other sound design to create a composition, a story that somebody is going to want to watch and somebody's going to get sucked into and enjoy. So yeah, I think the line between film and television has really blurred so much since I went to film school, especially with things like Netflix and Amazon Prime. you know. The Epstein show, more people watch the Epstein show than any movie I could have possibly been involved with. So, you know, for me, that was a big deal, knowing that, you know, over 100 million people watched my work around the world. Meant so much to me, something that would have been very hard for me to achieve if I had gone down the road of trying to break into film, I think. I didn't have any friends in film either, so I didn't have anybody to open that door for me.
Yeah. I'm not sure what your experience / skills are, or what you've learned and bring to your job as a quote unquote editor. But I think traditionally, and you mentioned when you went to film school, when I went to film school, editor we used to be called cutters, because that's all we did. You took the picture and then turned it around. How much do you get involved in dialogue smoothing and special effects or visual overlaying and all that kind of graphic stuff? Or is it you primarily, like you say, cut it and then turn it over to somebody else?
Well, it you know, it depends on the show. It depends on the scope of the project. Depends on the budget of the project. But for something that's going to be broadcast, there's always an offline process and an online process.
And what's
the offline process is what I do, which is assemble the show, score it, edit all the dialogue, do all the sound design, either create or incorporate graphics that are either created by me or by a graphics team. Again, it's dependent on the scope and the budget of the show. But yeah, and then I get it to time. So whatever the target running time is, I make sure that it's that time. And then I also make all the changes throughout the revision process. Once I picture lock it, it gets handed off to an online team. The online team almost invariably consists of a color person who will color correct the whole thing, and a sound mixer who will sweeten all the audio, sweeten the mix, make everything sound good. Everything that's in my timeline can be heard in that mix. So even though I do a lot of sound editing, I don't finish it. I don't finish the sound. And even though I do a lot of picture editing, I don't finish it per se. That goes with feature films as well. The cutter, the editor, will get the sound and the picture in the best shape that they can, and then it'll be handed off to different teams of people to finish the look of it and the sound of it.
Great. Questions, folks? Yep, Curtis.
What are some of the biggest differences you found in editing a documentary versus editing something of fiction?
Well, I haven't done a lot of fictional stuff. I've done primarily started off as a weekly news show, entertainment news show, and then I did like reality shows. That's what I cut my teeth on, was reality shows. So I can tell you the difference between editing a reality show and a doc. The doc is way more fun. Editing reality television is the most difficult editing challenge out there, because you have to make something really unpleasant watchable and entertaining. You have to take the most boring garbage you've ever seen in your life and somehow make it into a story that somebody is going to care enough about to watch. And believe me, if you ever get a chance to see raw footage from a reality show, you'll immediately understand what I mean. It's really difficult. And there's a lot of fudging that happens. There's a lot of say there's no drama. Well, we need drama. So we're going to make this person say this, and then we're going to set this up so it looks like he accidentally pushed her. And you know what I mean? There's a lot of fakery going on. So there's a lot less of that in docs. Since I started doing docs, thankfully I've done primarily this kind of work. And I work from a script, I work with writers, researchers, story producers. You know, I work with people that have put a lot of thought into what's going to happen in the show before I get started. So, and you know, as far as just the niceness factor of doing a doc, if it's a meaningful doc, and you have an opportunity to work with people that can all get together and make something good, you know, it feels more like you're doing something that becomes part of a historical record somehow. Something that people could look at years from now and say, oh, that's who Jeffrey Epstein was. That's what he did. And you know, have some assurance that the information that we gave them in that doc was as accurate as it could be. So, yeah, I definitely prefer doing docs. It's funny, too, because since I've started editing docs, I've started watching a lot less narrative film. And I watch a lot of docs now. My appreciation for them is really intensified the more of them I've worked on. Did I answer your question? Okay, cool.
Jump in, folks.
Hey, I know I'm not Captain Kirk over here, but you can ask me anything you want.
I'll ask another one, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
When you sit down to edit something, what's really like the first thing that you find yourself doing?
Well, it's all a constant revision process. So when I sit down at a show, more often than not, I have something called a string out. So the script has already been written. It's broken up into acts and or scenes, and an assistant editor will have taken that script and put together the roughest of rough assemblies of what is going to be in that scene, put on a timeline, and hand it off to me. So the very first thing I do is make sure that that matches the script, and then it's all about step by step, you know, honing the dialogue, adding music, adding coverage where I have to edit the dialogue so that there's no jump cut in the dialogue visual. And, you know, after a while, you wind up with a bunch of these little mini scenes, which then get strung out into larger sections, such as an act or, in Netflix case, an entire episode. And again, it's all about constant revision. So I'll work a scene for a day, hand it back to the producer. The producer will say, well, you know what? Even at that rough stage, they can get a sense of what's going to work, what's not going to work. We'll have a conversation about it. I get it back, we revise script, and it gets another pass. It gets a little better, and it gets a little closer to being done. And that process just kind of gets bigger and bigger and bigger until you wind up with, and I'll show you this. This is picture lock. Can I flip the camera here? How do I do that? There we go.
Oh.
So this is picture lock on, oh my goodness. Zoom flunky. Oh, did it? There we go, okay. So this is a 1 hour format show. There are 20 tracks of audio and 10 tracks of picture. And you can see it's pretty involved, and there's a lot of edits there. When this started with, sorry guys, so clumsy with my, that started as just a bunch of string outs. It started as the simplest, you know, some voiceover narration that was temporary, unedited interview, no music, no coverage, big black holes in the timeline that I had to, you know, fill with something. And over a course of, you know, about 4 or 5 weeks for a 1 hour show, it's done. It's locked. And that includes revisions not only from people on my team, but it includes notes from the network, the client. In this case, investigative discovery. They get 2 rounds of notes. We send them a rough cut, They send us notes back. We do those notes. That's called fine cut. Send them the fine cut. They send us back another round of notes. We do those notes, and that's picture lock. And that varies too. Some clients want 5 rounds. Netflix wanted 5 rounds. They ended up getting more like 10 rounds on Epstein. But that's it. So the first thing that goes through my mind is, holy cow, man, I got a lot of work to do. How am I going to make this into a TV show?
I was going to ask you about that. On the doc that I'm working on, my director's 3,000 miles away, and we communicate pretty regularly. How has the pandemic, or has it affected you? It sounds like maybe really not a whole lot, since you're all working as a remote server setup.
Yeah. So everybody on the team has access to the same media. So the only other remote job I ever did, I was sent a hard drive, and we would email bins back and forth, because that's how Avid works. It just links to the media. If I have a carbon copy of media that lives somewhere else, I can build a sequence in a bin and send just that bin to somebody else with a carbon copy of the media, and they can see my work.
Right.
So this is way better, because all the media sits in one location, and everybody just tunnels in over the internet and accesses the same media. So my showrunner can see my cut on Avid anytime she wants. I don't think the revision process, the biggest difference is oftentimes, more so earlier in my career, a producer is going to want to sit in the room with you and kind of look over your shoulder while you work. And, that's not my favorite scenario. You get used to it after a while, especially in television. But that obviously can't happen when you're not in the same building.
Right.
So I think that's been a challenge for a lot of folks. Fortunately, on this show, I'm working with a team of people that know me. They know I don't have to stand over my shoulder. They give me a deadline. I hit the deadline. I deliver the cut. They give me the notes, and we just move on. But I think that, Tom, I think that has been problematic for some producers who feel like they have to be in the room while the editor's working.
Well, and you of the producers / directors that you've worked with, it's got to take some courage and confidence in you as an editor to just turn it over to you and say, go at it. Have you had that experience?
Yes and no. Again, I think that they showed a lot more courage when I had like 4 credits on my resume.
Right.
That was definitely, and that's, unfortunately, this is the problem with breaking into the industry, is that nobody's going to have time to watch your web series or whatever else you've done. They just want to see your they want to see your credit list. And if they look at your credit list and they don't recognize anything, or they don't feel like they're looking at a body of professionally made work, they're not going to be instilled with that sense of trust that they need to sit you down for 3 or 4 weeks and say, okay, we'll see what you can do. So yeah, it's tough. And I think for a lot of people, the only way to establish a reputation is to start off as an assistant editor. And in the digital world, that's a hard job. It was a hard job in the film world too, but you need a lot of technical skills and a lot of savvy. And so many people are relying on you, and so much money's on the line. You need to know what you're doing, and you need to do it right. And if you can bear that work for 3 or 4 years, you can start making connections with people who will give you a shot at some editing. But yeah, I have to say, and not to be pessimistic, nowadays it feels like it's hard. I know a lot of assistant editors who are dying to edit, and the biggest hurdle for them is getting over that hump of becoming an editor. I was so different. I waited until I was 40, and I had a lot of other experience under my belt at that point. And I just told people, yeah, I'm an editor. I just said I was an editor, and I just kept saying that until somebody believed me. And that might be one approach to take. But it's going to be a lot harder for you to convince somebody if you're 22 and fresh out of film school unless you have a really amazing reel you can show them. Like that's if you've been making YouTube videos and you can put together a reel that's really fun and entertaining and flashy and really well edited, that could definitely help you at least get an interview. But yeah, breaking in as an editor is tough because of that, exactly what you mentioned. A large team of people responsible for a large amount of money have to be confident that you're going to get the job done and you're going to be close enough in the ballpark so that with a few revisions, it'll be ready for air or ready for a movie theater, or ready for Netflix.
Well, I think also that, so let's take James Steelman as the assistant editor, however long ago it was, and you're wanting to move up to editing. It takes not only a leap of faith for your potential employer to give you that spot, but then they've got to find somebody to take over for you as assistant editor.
Yeah.
So it's a double risk.
Yeah, because it is, and it's a catch-22 because you won't get the opportunity to edit unless you're a really good assistant editor. But if you're a really good assistant editor, nobody wants to see you go.
Right.
They need you as an assistant editor. And I know other former students of mine that are facing that very situation right now. And yeah, it's tough. I wish I could give you better advice about how to break that cycle. I didn't have to. I was an assistant editor on one film in 1996, and that's the only time I've really been truly an assistant editor.
Right. Other questions, folks?
I have another question, actually.
Yep. Anna,
Sure.
go.
So you mentioned that, you weren't the only editor on the Epstein Netflix show. How is it like working with multiple editors on like something that's episodic? Like, are you in charge of like one episode, or like how does that work?
Well, Epstein was a really different situation for a number of reasons. They actually had started making a show about Epstein before he was rearrested and before his suicide. And when he was arrested, I believe it was in August of 2019, or maybe July. But regardless, the show they were making had to be put on hiatus because they recognized that the story was changing under their feet. So the original team of 4 editors was put on hiatus, which means that they weren't getting paid. And most editors like to keep getting paid. So those editors went off and they went on other shows because they, if they only were going to be waiting a week or two, that's one thing. But the Epstein story kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger over that summer. And it didn't go back into the edit room until I think it was September. And by then, I established myself at Radical. So initially, yes, I was given episode 2. Episode 2 was my episode. The revision process on Epstein was so insane that my work can be found in all 4 episodes. Every editor on the show's work can be found in my episode. And I wound up getting pulled off on another show. And, it was just it was literally nuts. In the end, 2 editors got credit for every episode because I got pulled off before it was technically finished. Another editor had to come in and sit down and finish episode 2. So even though the vast majority of it is my work, I didn't finish it, so I didn't get sole edit credit on it. But I did get additional editing on all episodes because my work is literally in every episode. So it's great working on with a team of editors. You don't have to do everything yourself. It's amazing, especially on a show that ambitious. It was big. The experience will vary based on the caliber of the people that you're working with. And I'm lucky. This was at a big, pretty high-end production outfit. All the editors on that team were amazing editors, and they were all great people. That whole team really bonded on that show. It was really great experience all around. Did I answer your question?
You did. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Jump in, folks. I got questions that I'd rather you ask.
Can I ask a question really quickly?
Yeah.
I just had a question for you, James, about networking and for people who aren't necessarily in the editing business. When you first got out of Keene State, you said you knew people who were in LA.
No, I actually, not when I first got out of Keene State.
Okay. So
No.
how did you meet those people?
Oh, when I stopped teaching at Keene State, by then, yes, I knew people in LA.
Yes.
Is that what you meant?
Yeah, so just those people that you met and other people that you met that you networked with.
Well, the guy who got me my first job was my boss at Avid. So he and I left Avid about the same time. I went to Keene to teach, and he went to LA to become an editor. And so by the time I got out there, he was pretty well established, and he had a good enough relationship with this one company that was a really low budget company to give me a shot, primarily because they could pay me less than they'd have to pay anybody else. Networking in any industry, I guess, is a lot like networking in life. You kind of have to be a little outgoing. You have to take chances. Sometimes you have to create connections yourself. There have been times I've been out of work for maybe 2 or 3 months, and I'm really hungry and I want to get back to work, but I'm not getting any phone calls or emails. I'll just look at something I watched recently and say, oh, who made that? And then I look them up. Oh, they're in New York. And I send just a cold email. Hey, I'm this guy and I've done this stuff, and here's my resume. What you got going on? I saw the show and I loved it. I'd love to work for you guys. It gets easier, I think, as you get more experienced. The best thing, and obviously this is all complicated so much by COVID. When I graduated from college, I just went out to LA, and it scared the hell out of me, and I didn't meet anybody. But on the way back, I wound up in New Mexico, and I made some friends with some industry people there. You got to kind of get out there. I mean, you can meet a lot of people online, but there's no substitute for actually meeting people in person. If you live in LA, you're going to meet industry people, provided that you go out and you're sociable. I'm not encouraging drinking, but you meet a lot of people in bars. You'll meet a lot of industry people in bars. You can find out where industry people for a specific company hang out and go, kind of nose your way to a conversation with one of them. But again, right now, this is all so complicated by COVID, and it's definitely had an impact on the industry. The first few months of it, I was out of work. Almost everybody I knew was out of work. There was no work happening. What little work was happening was all being done remotely, so there was no networking happening. We really all have to just hope that this situation gets better soon and we can get back to some semblance of normal. How am I doing with your question? I feel like I'm dancing around it a little bit. Did I answer it at all?
That was very good. That's pretty much what I was wondering.
Specifically, you want to know, how do I meet these people, right? I want to get some work. Other things you can try doing, especially once things settle down and there's more production happening, look for opportunities where you can work for free. Even that first editing gig that I got, the only way that they were willing to give me a chance is if I agreed to come in and work the first day for free, so they could figure out if I knew what I was doing. Working for free stinks and everybody hates it, but if you do it and you have a good attitude about it and you work hard, people will notice you, and you can start networking that way. And there's tons of production going on in the Boston area. Not as much now, but it will come back. And people on small projects are always advertising because they need help. And look for those projects, the ones that don't pay much, or that you can get on the set and start working with other people and start establishing a reputation for yourself and start meeting people that want to do the same thing you want to do. So that's probably the best practical advice I can give you. Stay out of bars.
But James, you'd mentioned earlier the importance of contacts, and the contacts that you make, particularly in schools, we call the mafia. I went to Southern Cal, so we had the USC mafia, and I've been really surprised by both our grads who have gone out to work out on the West Coast and certainly on the East Coast. We've got what I call the KSC mafia, 5 or 10 people in LA, I know. I know a lot of people of James's era who are working professionally in New York. So you maintain contacts with them?
Yeah.
Through the F board, the Facebook. I hate Facebook, but certainly through us as well.
Yeah, look for any of you guys. Look for me on LinkedIn. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, you're more than welcome to.
Yeah, but who are other grads there? I mean, Aaron Vega,
well,
Peter Haas is out there.
Aaron Vega is not in New York. He's in Western Mass.
Oh, is he? Oh, he was, okay.
Peter Haas is down here, although I don't have much contact with him. Paul Doherty is down here.
Yep.
Dave Conti.
Yep.
I'm drawing a blank. There's several others.
You mentioned
as far as like having a Keene State College grads back, I'll always do whatever I can to try to help somebody, whether it's help them get an AE job or an intern job.
Right.
By all means, and that's why I encourage all of you guys, connect with me on LinkedIn. Just send me a little note saying you saw me here, and I'll be happy to add you to my LinkedIn network. And the fact is, though, unfortunately, I'm an editor, so I don't hire people. I can put in good words. I can get your resume in the right people's hands. Provided I'm not trying to lock a cut and I have a deadline over my head, try to answer questions, give you advice. Because I think that you're right. I think there is a real connection with people graduate from the same school. And I wouldn't have ever got my first job without help. You got to pay it forward. I'm more than happy to help any way I can. Anybody that asks me for something reasonable, I'm happy to try my best for you.
Well, if you get to New York, James knows where all the good poker games are.
I used to know where all the good bars are. Now they're all closed.
We're closing in on about an hour. James, thank you. Anybody else got other questions? They'll probably hang around for a little while, but this is our chance to talk to our first grad and pick his brains on particularly post-production. Ask away.
How often would you and another editor or director get in a dispute about a certain edit or a scene that is being cut, and who would usually have the last word if that situation were to happen?
I missed the very first part of your question. Are you asking how often that happens?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
With his camera.
I would say it happens less the more work that you do. I early on, I think I was too defensive of my work, and I think I tried to defend my decisions too much, and I lost most of those battles. And I think that over time, I learned that that's the kind of thing where you really have to pick your battles. The showrunner is always going to have final say. The executive producer is always going to have final say. The client who's paying for the whole thing is going to have final say even over those people. If I feel strongly enough about something to push back on a note, I will. And more often than not, because I pick those battles carefully, if I do push back on a note these days, more often than not, I'm going to get my way, because I can explain why my decision and my decisions were better than what they're asking me to do. In a worst case scenario, I'll do it the way they ask me to do it, and then I'll say, see, this doesn't work. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's tough. Just like every part of a collaborative project, you always have to try your best to keep your ego in check. And I think, 12, 13 years ago when I was first starting out, I wasn't as good at that. And it's something that you get used to over time. Basically, as an editor, you get paid for people to second guess your decisions. You'll get asked questions like, but did you use the best shot? You know, and you have to bite your tongue because you can't say, no, I actually looked for the worst shot I could find. I thought that's what you wanted. So, you know, more often than not, the places where I get into it with people where I'll really make a stand is with music. I'm a trained musician, and I honestly think that helps make me a good editor. But when I'm scoring a show, I take a lot of time to do the music right. And music notes are the most common notes. Somebody doesn't like the music. And music notes are also the vaguest notes, like, well, we need something bigger, or we need something more exciting, or we need something more neutral, you know. So if I know the cue is perfect, I just won't change it. I won't change it. I'll make them give it to me in another note. And I won't say anything to anybody. I just won't do it. And usually it gets by them the second time. So that's sneaky, but that's something I do. I leave them low-hanging fruit elsewhere. Stuff that they can't help but notice, that I know they're going to note. And then they don't notice the cue that they already noted that I didn't change.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Other questions, folks? Times are running out.
Hey Tom, this is Mark in the production booth.
Yep.
I thought we might try something we haven't done before. Rose Condanis has been with us for the whole program, and I'm guessing she probably knows James.
I saw Rose in there.
Can I try and bring her in?
Let's move Rose up to a member of the Academy. Hopefully we'll find her. I don't see her picture yet, but no, I saw that Rose was one of our attendees who up until now has been viewing us.
I'm glad I kept my
she's now part of the class. The question is whether she's
Yeah, don't quite see her, but Rose, are you with us? Can we hear you? There she is. Hi, Rose. Can't hear you. Unmute yourself.
Yes.
Here we go.
I have really enjoyed seeing James and hearing about his journey. And I was one of the very helped people along the way as a journalism professor when he was basically helping me with Avid. And I just want to say that I hope that all of you students are really listening carefully, because his journey sounds like it has been a really successful one.
Thank you, Rose. Great to see you.
Well, and we haven't obviously, Rose was here. I don't know how long before I got here, Rose, but we'd always been collaborative since I got here. Since then, your colleagues, Mark Timney, Chad and I in journalism, we work so similarly together that I see a real synthesis. And that's one of the reasons, for those of you who are still with us, the building that we're in right now, when we can get physically in there, used to be the Dining Commons. It's now the Media Arts Center, with the idea that you would bring together particularly graphic design, journalism, communication, not so much communication, but journalism unquestionably, graphic design, film, the associated visual arts, because we work so similarly together. And hopefully that will infuse us with working together as our colleagues. And I've found that Chad and Mark and I talk a lot, and the line between, and James, maybe you can even address that with the journalistic aspect of the Netflix series that you did on Epstein, the line between quote unquote film production and television journalism and television broadcast is, I really see it getting less and less well defined.
Absolutely. I think so. Rose, you want to comment on that?
Well, that's kind of been my goal for the 32 years I was at Keene State. And I just think that the technology and also the pandemic is forcing people to see how they need to be working with teams, that it's not an isolated kind of job. And you certainly have spoken to that very clearly tonight, James. It's a very team-oriented job, and there's a lot of the aspects of, we were in the same building, we did do some things together. There's so much more, and there's so much more to learn that journalism can learn from film, and film can learn from journalism. And I was so delighted to hear James say that documentary was becoming his, genre. Because there's just so much that journalists can offer in that area, and that journalists can learn from film in that area of documentary. I definitely think that things are moving in that direction, and I do think even the pandemic is forcing that to happen. Even though I'm retired, I do keep up with what's happening to journalism as it goes forward. And a lot of barriers are being broken down. A lot of the old ways of doing things are changing. Giulio Del Sesto is doing quite a bit of work now with public television, for example. And people are moving, are looking for opportunities in areas that they didn't expect to. I've had film people come back to me and say, teach me how to write for broadcast, because that was not something that they necessarily learned in the film area. And so it's not easy to do in 2 or 3 emails, but there's this crossover thing that can happen, that I think that that young people, especially, as well as the faculties, should be kind of engendering in the students and in their own work, because I think that is the future.
It's all storytelling, whether it's journalism or fictional film. It's still it's storytelling. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you, Rose. I think there's a lot of, and after working at NBC for a while and doing a lot of what I would consider, just journalistic pieces, there's still a strong desire from people that they still oftentimes they want somewhat of a cinematic feel. They want it to feel, they want their audience to be engaged. They know their audience will be engaged if it feels like they're watching a movie. And so even if it's all real and true and fact checked and non-libelous, you can still, I was able to still bring some cinematic qualities to my edit, which hopefully made that programming more palatable for more people in their audience. And I think that's why I was at NBC for almost 3 years. Yeah. Because they recognized that I brought that to the table. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Here
in the film program, I'd always been kind of unapologetically the mainstream Hollywood narrative guy. And I was interested in James's comment, and Rose, you kind of mentioned maybe the same thing. There's a satisfaction to having a script, but in some respects with the script and narrative mainstream Hollywood stuff, there's your structure, and you just plop the shots in there. And in some respects, it's a little less creative. On these 2 docs that I'm working on right now, James, you mentioned it earlier in your discussion, it's almost more interesting to take this amalgam of mess, potentially, of footage, and massaging it into a coherent story. Yeah. And really learn to respect and enjoy editing docs. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's it is. I think it is a largely more creative process. I think that when you're talking about really good feature filmmakers, they can see the edited piece in their brain already. So as an editor, you might surprise them with a few things, but by and large, a good, solid visual director of a narrative film, they're shooting that thing one way. They're shooting it in the way they want you to edit it. And so it may be a little less creative, I think, than what I've been doing. And
Always said that the production aspect of shooting was his least favorite part of filmmaking, because he knew exactly what it was going to look like.
yeah, exactly. And if you look at, like, going way back to Hitchcock and his storyboards, he knew where his edits were going to look like. He knew exactly where the cut points were going to be. Look at the shower scene in Psycho. I mean, it's an intensely edited piece that was meticulously planned, shot by shot. And I think a lot of people would like to credit the editor with that, but that was largely Hitchcock's work.
Right. Other questions, folks? James can't spend his entire life with us, although who knows? We may see him back up here sometime soon.
I'd love to come back for a visit.
Hey, Tom.
Yes,
It's Mark. It's Mark again. Do you mind if I ask a question? It's heavily influenced by a question that Megan asked Lee Unkrich last week. It was about, she asked about a scene in Toy Story that was really significant to her, and Lee gave us a great kind of backstory about what went into that and kind of the thinking that went on. And I was wondering if James could do the same for Epstein, whether it's episode 2 or something. Could you give us kind of a little story if we go back and watch it again, or about perhaps some of the discussions of editors or directors behind the scenes?
Oh, it's hard with the Epstein show because it changed so many times. We made that show 5 or 6 times. And I mean that literally. Like, we made at least 6 different versions, profoundly different versions of that show. And so it's hard to nail down one moment where I felt like there's only one moment I can really think of. It was one of the first things that I cut on that show, and it never got touched. And that's always a really nice compliment. There's a scene that ended up in episode 1 of one of the survivors, and she has a moment where she breaks down, and she's overcome with the emotion of remembering this story. And all my training and all my discipline as an editor would say, we have to cut. We can't show this woman being this upset. That we have to protect our subject, and we have to, we can't show her losing it like this. And I ignored every instinct, and I just left her on screen. I didn't cut away, and I used the softest music I could find. And when I rolled it back and watched it, it made me cry. And when I showed the showrunner and my producer, it made them cry. And that scene, over all the revisions, that scene never changed one frame. The showrunner wouldn't let anybody touch it. Is that the kind of thing that you're asking me about?
Yeah,
that
was James. That was perfect. That was awesome.
James, you mentioned the many revisions, and you went over the Epstein thing 5, 6 different times. Were the changes that you and your editors, your fellow editors, found yourselves forced to make because of his changing circumstance and story, or was it a directorial approach? The director decided, hey, I didn't like this.
It was the client.
Okay.
Yeah, the client as we said, the client always gets final say. And I don't think I'm violating my NDA to say that the client was extraordinarily hard to please on the show. And not because they felt like we made a bad show, but because they were extraordinarily concerned about how they would be perceived based on the tone of the show. And it's a completely understandable concern. We didn't want to come across as being exploitative of these women. We wanted to be their champion. We wanted to give them a safe place to tell the world what happened to them in a way that wasn't exploitative, it wasn't cheap, it wasn't dirty, I guess. I don't know how else to say it. And Netflix knew there was a lot at stake, not only in terms of their audience, but also in terms of any potential legal ramifications they face. So they second-guessed themselves more than any client I've ever seen. And again, because of that, we redid the show again and again and again and again and again. And I'm fine with that. I mean, first of all, it kept me gainfully employed for 6 months, which is fantastic. Second of all, in the end, I think we did land on a great solution. There were other versions of the show I liked too, but in the end, I was very happy with the one that wound up going to air. The funny thing is that right before the last revision, the last blow up, was the first time all the editors were allowed to sit in a room and watch the whole show from beginning to end, uninterrupted, on a big screen. And we all loved it. And we were all so blown away because we'd had our heads in the trenches on it so long, we'd lost sight of the big picture. And I hadn't seen even a couple of these episodes. I hadn't seen the latest versions of them. And so we all sat in a room and we all watched it and we all loved it. We were like, man, it's so weird that nobody else is ever going to see this. Nobody else is ever going to see this version of the show. And then we made that last giant push, that last giant revision. And it's a drastically different show. It's different. But anyway, I can't get into too many of the details because of legalities.
Right. You're getting lots of good coverage on it. Again, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
That being said, then, what I'd like to do is thank James Steelman for being our first KSC grad to come and talk to everybody. Everybody hang around for a bit. Next week, we'll be speaking to another Keene State College grad, Kelsey Bean. Will be here to talk to us about her experiences in the industry after graduating. I'd like to thank everybody for watching these webinar versions of career development here at Keene State College, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, James.